Hey everybody, this is Chris with PhoneArena and this is the Xperia M2. Now the M2 is a new mid-range device from Sony and it has the hardware to prove it. It has a 4.8-inch screen, is powered by a quad-core processor and 1GB of RAM and has an 8-megapixel camera. So far so good, but let's find out how exactly it translates into the real world. On the outside, nothing really distinguishes the Xperia M2 from the current Sony crop of smartphones, and it's probably safe to say that this is a deliberate effort. Indeed, Sony's omni-balanced design language has been well received by critics and consumers alike, but it would be wrong to say that the M2 didn't go through certain design changes when compared to its predecessor. So, at the front we're looking at some noticeable bezel slim sizing, allowing for a relatively small footprint despite a larger screen. At the top you'll find the earpiece and front-facing camera and also a small notification light. On the right side of the device we have a two-step shutter key, a volume rocker and a power button, but only that last one provides satisfying tactile feedback and travel time. Turning the M2 around, we see that the convex-shaped rear shell of its predecessor is gone and a perfectly flat plastic back has taken up its place. Lastly, the loudspeaker can now be found at the bottom side of the M2. The Sony Xperia M2 made a considerable jump in screen size over its predecessor, and its LCD TFT display now measures in at 4.8 inches. Unfortunately, the 540 by 960 pixel resolution of the panel actually results in a slightly inferior pixel density of about 230 ppi. Turning away from specs rehashing, let's talk quality. Core temperature at over 11,000 kelvins is overly cold, so whites and different shades of grey have a blue tinge to them. Overall color reproduction is decent, even though colors like red tend to be oversaturated a bit. The rest of the color spectrum is mostly rendered well, with acceptable deviations. Lastly, maximum brightness is quite acceptable for this class at 460 nits, though the reflective glass on top does limit how much of the display we can make out outside. In typical Sony fashion, the Android 4.3 Jelly Bean operating system driving the Xperia M2 has been thoroughly skinned. That's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you consider Sony's design approach with overlays that are simple, uniform and easy on the eyes. And if the default theme is not to your liking, you have quite some choice in terms of personalization, like different themes, a different wallpaper for your lock screen, or adding additional quick toggles in the pull-down notification panel. The Xperia M2 also comes preloaded with a few apps, most of which courtesy of different Sony services. For example, Sony Select is a small curated apps and themes market, and Social Live News is a newsreader with an ultra-simplified design. Apps like Music Unlimited, Video Unlimited and even PlayStation Mobile can also be found on board. The now trendy quad-core Snapdragon 400 chip by Qualcomm found itself a new home with the Xperia M2 and, along with its trusty Adreno 305 GPU, makes operating the handset very pleasant. Of course, that 1GB of RAM on board also helps with that. After some time with the M2, we can conclude that navigating the interface is speedy and we found no signs of lag. Load times for apps are also acceptable. In fact, even sophisticated, graphics-intensive games like Asphalt 8 run solidly with no drops in frame rate. As for internal storage, there are 8GB to be found on board, but only 5GB of that is available for use. Thankfully, up to 32GB more can be added through a micro SD card. An extension of the potent hardware configuration, the browsing experience with the built-in Chrome browser on the Xperia M2 is a smooth affair. Even heavier, image-based websites load up quick, and navigating them puts no strain on the processor. Connectivity options are plentiful too. There's LTE, Bluetooth 4.0, 5GHz Wi-Fi, NFC, DLNA, assisted GPS with GLONASS support, and even MHL compatibility for streaming the M2 screen onto a bigger monitor. The Xperia M2 sports an 8-megapixel rear shooter with a Sony Exmor RS sensor, f2.4 aperture lens and an LED flash. Unfortunately, we were disappointed with its performance across the board. First off, keep in mind that in the default superior auto shooting mode, the M2 churns out 5.5 megapixel snaps instead of 8 megapixel ones. This is exactly how the Xperia Z1 and Z2 operates under the automatic mode. In other words, all 8 megapixels are being used, but the end result is scaled down in order to arrive at a higher quality snap and also allow for some lossless zooming. Speaking of snaps, those were consistently exposed properly in our experience, but the overall look of the images was just poor. They're contrasty with messed up colors and a rather persistent green fringing. What's more, every now and then they come out unpleasantly over-sharpened, while the rest of the time the software delivers rather soft and quite noisy pictures. Worse yet, some shots had some very serious visual artifacts. Images taken in poorly lit environments and indoors are no better. We again have proper exposition, but colors are still incorrect and noise and softness are still there. The LED flash also fails to properly illuminate darker scenes. As for video capture, the situation is also pretty dire. Despite shooting in 1080p resolution, the resulting clips are poor. They deliver a limited amount of detail, unattractive colors, and offer horrible sound reproduction. The usual crop of Sony-themed multimedia apps is what you'll find preloaded on the Xperia M2. As per usual, their design is pleasing and uniform, and they often offer some extra functionality you won't find on stock Android. For example, the gallery is interconnected with Sony's Play Memories online service, which allows you to automatically upload photos to its servers and have them synchronized throughout all your connected devices. The Walkman music player, for its part, has extras such as Clear Audio Plus, which automatically enhances sound clarity. Speaking of music, the M2's loudspeaker is medium loud and maxes out at 75 decibels, allowing you to fill a small room with music. Call quality sure is a massive disappointment with the Xperia M2, ranking among the very worst we've had the displeasure to work with. Starting with the earpiece, the situation is just critical, even with Sony's sound enhancing clear face feature on. The people on the other side sound as if they have a very serious case of the stuffy nose, and toner information was just lost on us. Worse still, volume output is mediocre and we often had trouble understanding what's being said. Sadly, the microphone is only slightly better. Your voice again loses a whole bunch of its toner information on its way to the other side, and clarity is just poor. Overall, that's an F- for the M2. Looking at battery life, the Sony Xperia M2 proved quite enduring and managed to squeeze the whopping 9 hours and 19 minutes in our custom battery test. This makes the M2 the most enduring phone in our rank list in this class. If that isn't enough, whenever you're low on charge, you can activate Sony's Stamina mode, which essentially disables data and Wi-Fi when the screen is off, further helping you conserve battery. In conclusion, the Xperia M2 is one truly inconsistent device. On one hand, you have an attractive device, adequate processing power and record-setting battery life. On the other, however, you have a mediocre display, a poor camera and downright unacceptable call quality. What's worse, the Xperia M2 is just too expensive. Right now, the M2 can be had for about $300 in the States, but in Europe and India, that number ranges from anywhere between $330 to the whopping $400. This exposes this new Sony mid-ranger to quite some competition. For one, both the Motorola Moto X and the Google Nexus 5 can be had for the equivalent of about $50 more, and both offer a massively superior performance. Even the slightly bigger Samsung Galaxy Grand 2 will strike you a much better deal. In the end, the Sony Xperia M2, at this price at least, is just poor value for money. Once again, this was Chris with PhoneArena, thank you for tuning in.